shockingly, we had an election with an actual result last night. Team Rising is here to dive into everything New Hampshire.
We got Democratic strategist Roger Fisk and Patrice Onwuka. She's senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum. Two great friends of the show. How are you guys?
Fantastic.
Great.
So we have these results out of New Hampshire. Let's throw them up on the screen. Bernie Sanders at 26% of the vote, officially been declared the winner by the Associated Press. Buttigieg, he's got 24% of the vote. Amy Klobuchar at 20%. Roger, you spent a decent amount of time in New Hampshire and on campaigns. What are some of your takeaways from this race?
I'm waiting. First off, thanks so much for having me, and it's wonderful to be here with Patrice. I'm waiting for the Google Earth images that the White House is going to generate that show the caravan of buses from Minnesota to New Hampshire, because clearly there were thousands of them. I think there's two narratives. I mean, the top, is plays out the way it does. I think it, is roughly where a lot of us expected it to be. The Klobuchar story, and then the addendum to that is the gap between Klobuchar and Warren. I mean, the forensics of this is going to be very, very interesting. So that's kind of where my attention goes. And then on the operational level, because part of me is always looking at this, through the eyes of getting up that next day and how do you take advantage of an opportunity like this, is Klobuchar needs to hire like 1,000 people in the next 48 hours. So there's going to, I don't know how you do that if
And
you
I
bring
think
in
Bloomberg
like
has already hired them all.
firm.
Yeah, Bloomberg already hired them, Roger.
Right, and I mean, and if she can really go out and compete for talent, and to the extent that there's any left really to be scooped up, but she's got to staff up at least 8 or 10 dates down the calendar, and she's got to do it like today.
Yeah.
So that's the operational level. In addition to just kind of like the horse race narrative, that's one of the things I find really interesting.
So that's one of the things I actually heard was, Patrice, Amy Klobuchar, she might have had a good night. She might have raised a couple $1 million, $5 million. Doesn't matter. You can't. There's no. All the airtime is largely bought. The elections are like right now. It's all in such a short amount of time. You can't hire enough staff. You can't get out the vote campaign organization. That really goes to show, I mean, something you were talking about here months ago, Roger, is like you got to start this thing like 15 months out, or realistically it's just flash in the pan, and what is this thing all really about?
Well, but I think also it demonstrates that the loser here was socialism. While Bernie Sanders won and it was the top of the ticket, listen to me, the next two were people who are centrist, who are not embracing.
70% of the electorate said they support Medicare for all. A Democratic Socialist just won Iowa and New Hampshire, and is the front runner in the campaign.
Yeah.
2/3 of them say they want a fundamental. I mean, I just don't know how you come out of a night when Bernie Sanders is the victor and say that socialism lost.
I'm not saying that he wasn't number one and wasn't at the top, but I am saying that when you look at the number 2 and number 3 spots combined, those are not socialists.
But
those are people who are competing to the middle.
This is not. But look, Biden lost, and he's a centrist, so centrism must be failing. It's a hollow analysis because this is not the way that voters think. You can't add candidates together and say, if we add them together, they're the winner. That's not how math works.
But I think to ignore the fact that not everyone is behind the socialist on the socialist bus is actually going to ignore what could happen down the line in some of these other states.
So how do you explain the fact that Bernie Sanders is most trusted on healthcare, most trusted on climate change? 70% of voters in Iowa and New Hampshire say that they want Medicare for all. How do you explain that? Is that a moderate position?
That's the Democratic base.
I mean, I happen to think that is a moderate position. Yeah. It's a very, moderate in terms of the world. We're the radicals here who have this crazy health care
moderate
system.
In terms of the Democratic Party, not moderate in terms of the larger American electorate. Now we are talking about the primary. Sure, I think there's interest in how do you expand Medicare for everybody. And when you dig into the actual numbers and you ask deeper questions about how much you're willing to pay towards Medicare for all, we do see support start to drop. So, my larger point here is that, yes, Bernie Sanders won. And by the way, he won in a smaller margin than he certainly won in 2016, in part because you had a lot more votes splitting that moderate centrist lane. You can't ignore the fact, though, that I think the entire Democratic electorate is not fully bought on the left, the far left bus.
Well, let's dig into this, Roger. I've actually been hearing this quite a bit on Cape, which is that Bernie didn't win enough votes in order to show he's viable. He seems to have a ceiling. He hasn't been able to consolidate or create a coalition. Is there anything to that? Because in my mind, what it is that this is kind of like a Trump phenomenon, where Trump came in there, he came in third in Iowa, then he came in, even though Bernie basically won Iowa, popular vote totals, and then you go and you look at New Hampshire, he wins New Hampshire, is that actually creates the space for people to just start jumping on the bandwagon rather than, not having people join you. What do you think, having gone through this yourself?
Well, just to dovetail briefly on the last point, Exhibit A in the conversation about socialism is the farm bill that passes overwhelmingly every year. So if anyone ever wants to talk about this country's relationship with socialism, I suggest we start with agriculture, because that's some ripe territory. There's an appetite for overcomplicating these things sometimes, and I say that in this way: winning is winning. Yeah, like. It's pretty obvious, and this is the thing that has poked the hole and is allowing the air to come out of the Biden narrative and everything else. There's only so long you can talk about electability and not win, and there's only so long that you can win and still have people question electability, right? So I think those two narratives are going to somewhat kind of go away, and then I think the one of the sub-narratives of that is. Are the recently migrated Klobuchar people, is that an expression of, like, we just don't like Buttigieg and Sanders? Or is that like an actual overt, we're with Amy kind of statement? And I'm thinking it's kind of maybe the first part of that rather than the second. Yeah. But we'll see how that plays out.
Well, we've seen this. This is something we've tracked this entire primary, which is that outside of Bernie Sanders, basically every other candidate, maybe with Biden accepted, is a media creation. When the media says they did great, they jump up in the polls. When the media says they did terrible, they fall down in the polls. Why? Because their bases are primarily college-educated white people whose number one priority is beating Trump. So when the media says, this is the person to beat Trump, they all jump on board. And when they say, well, no, maybe not this one, maybe it's this one, then they all jump over here. To Sagar's point, as Bernie Sanders actually wins these contests, you will see more and more people who feel like they have permission to vote for Bernie Sanders, who like him on the issues. On the issues, I think if it was just on the issues, he'd be running away with this thing. That's what the polls show. The question for him has always been electability, because the media has relentlessly said for decades that someone who labels themselves as a democratic socialist can't win. But to Roger's point, as he does rack up wins, suddenly you go, well, maybe he can win, actually.
Yeah. What do you think, Patrice? I'm curious about
that. I get your point, and to his credit, he has single-handedly turned the idea of democratic socialism into something people can embrace. And I actually make a very strong comparison to Trump voters in 2016 versus now. You had those invisible Trump supporters, people who would never show up in the polling, but who knew that they were supporting this candidate and were behind him for a number of reasons, businessman or what he was going to do for the economy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think you do have a migration of support behind Bernie Sanders, and you do have now people who are more willing to embrace him. Does that mean, though, that he's going to get the nomination? I'm still skeptical of that.
Well, we should say this. Look, Nate Silver and a lot of the models, Dave Wasserman, these election guys who I really respect, are all saying the odds of a contested convention are higher than ever. So from that perspective, Roger, do you think it is possible that Sanders could walk in with a plurality of delegates, but not a majority, and not walk out the Democratic nominee?
Yes.
Wow. So that's just something that...
No, if there's... Yeah. And I've said this before, I've done 3 presidential campaigns, and the less you interact with the DNC, the better. And I mean that. But if he rolls into it with the math on his side and the numbers on his side, it's completely within the scope of possibility that the DNC would look at parliamentarian maneuvers that would deny him becoming the nominee.
It would break the party, though.
Yeah, how do you think that would go?
Oh, you were kind enough to agree with one of my earlier points earlier, and I tend to agree with a lot of my own points as well. And I say that in this way, the really interesting stuff for me right now is like someone right now in Manchester is sitting down with like a senior Yang person. And someone right now in Concord or Portsmouth is sitting down with a Bennett person, right? And like, if you can start to stitch those together, for example, if the Klobuchar people are really good at this, and they can say, look, we were on the outside looking in with you guys for a long time. Now I have this little window, like come aboard and help me. Then that's 2 or 3%. That's 2 or 3%. if
Very generous, Michael Bennett.
right, and then even
0.05,
more
let's be
importantly
real.
is can the Sanders people be reaching out and having those conversations?
Right.
Because I would submit to you, if they can do that quiet outreach and coalition building away from all the online noise and setting aside some of the abrasive kind of tonality of that stuff, that will determine. I mean, if he can do that stuff right now, that will take a lot of the wind out of a potentially
I think that's a
contested
good
convention.
point. It's kind of a transitional period for them where it's no longer like we just need to. It's time to start expanding. I think that's a point well taken. We're going to look forward in the next block. You guys
Sit
stick
tight.
with us. We'll be back right after this.